In an alternate universe where Hillary Clinton won 80,000 more votes in 3 swing states, our next guest would probably be the President's National Security Advisor, if not Secretary of State. Jake Sullivan was Clinton's top foreign policy advisor in 2016. Before that, senior aide to President Obama, one of the key negotiators on the whole Iran nuclear deal, which President Trump has now threatened to tear up. And Jake Sullivan is with us from Washington, D.C. Jake, welcome to Planet America.
Thanks for having me.
So first to the big news of the week. Rex Tillerson abruptly ousted from the State Department. What do you make of that decision and the way that it was made?
Nobody deserves to be treated like that, bottom line. It doesn't matter if it's happening at the highest levels of the U.S. government, or it's a family member, or it's a colleague at work, or it's anyone. You deserve to be treated with some basic level of respect and dignity. And for Rex Tillerson to be fired by tweet, having been called back from abroad, it's humiliating. I don't think it's befitting the service he provided to the country, whatever quarrels I have with him, and it's really unfortunate. But at the end of the day, no matter who occupies the chair as Secretary of State, Donald Trump is still the President and Commander-in-Chief. And the direction of U.S. foreign policy and the tone of U.S. foreign policy is going to be set from the top. So while there's chaos and dysfunction below him, and Pompeo will represent something different from Tillerson, ultimately this comes down to the guy sitting in the Oval Office, and that's Donald Trump.
Does this mean that a handbrake on Donald Trump's foreign policy has been relieved now?
I would say yes. It's certainly the case that on some key issues, Rex Tillerson was a voice of caution on the question of pulling out of the Paris Climate Agreement. Tillerson advocated against that. On the issue that's before the president right now about whether he should junk the Iran nuclear agreement, Tillerson was an advocate for the United States sticking by its word. Pompeo, I think, is deeply ideological on some of these issues, particularly Iran, but also deeply political. He's a political creature, and he's going to want to cultivate President Trump. And so I don't see him being someone who tries to restrain Trump's worst instincts.
Given, as you mentioned, the question of the recertification of the Iran deal is on the near horizon, at or about the time of this scheduled meeting between Trump and Kim Jong Un, how are those two related to us? Obviously, they're both nuclear agreements of sorts, but how does one play into another?
Well, I think it doesn't take a genius to figure out, or an expert to figure out, the basic commonsensical notion that walking away from the Iran deal just as you're walking into a summit on North Korea is going to undermine American credibility about whether we're prepared to stick to the nuclear agreements we make. And that's our credibility with the North Koreans themselves, with our allies and partners, with the countries we've brought along in this pressure campaign. And so, straightforwardly, I think it would be a big blunder for the United States to do this. But I think it's important for people to understand in Australia and elsewhere that the administration has the exact opposite logic at play. They believe that walking away from the Iran nuclear deal could actually strengthen their hand at the table, not weaken it, because they think it shows that the United States is only going to take the strongest, best deal in the world. I think that that is deeply flawed, and they're talking themselves into something that will end up being a big mistake. But there is a very real chance that the United States withdraws from the nuclear deal in a couple months' time.
Obviously, when it comes to any negotiation, it's important to try and understand what's in the head of the other side. When it comes to North Korea, what do you think their objectives are if this meeting goes ahead, and what they're thinking about the fact that suddenly Rex Tillerson, who was kind of out of the loop last week anyway, is now being replaced? Are they feeling good, bad or indifferent to all this?
I think the North Koreans want the same thing today that they've wanted for the last 20 years. And that is respect and legitimacy, being able to sit down across from the President of the United States as an equal, and getting a summit means they will achieve that. An alleviation of the sanctions pressure that they have been feeling more and more acutely in the past several months, and getting into a diplomatic process will help them achieve that. And then time for them to assess their options and figure out when and if they want to take the next steps forward on their program. And getting into a negotiating process will help them achieve that as well. So this all sets up fairly nicely for the North Koreans. And for Donald Trump, it sets up not too badly either, because he gets the pageantry and the spectacle of this big summit. And he also gets a pause on North Korea moving forward on its nuclear program in ways that could hasten a decision on the use of military force. It doesn't solve the problem. It doesn't resolve the issue of denuclearization, but it does give these two leaders each something that they want. And I think that's why we find ourselves in the position we're in now.
This week, Jake Sullivan, the Republican majority on the House Intelligence Committee issued its report after essentially wrapping up their investigation with a long list of people they didn't ultimately feel the need to speak to, and concluded there was no collusion between Russia and the Trump campaign in 2016, and that it didn't have an effect on the outcome of that campaign. With the benefit of a bit of hindsight now, what is your sense of that?
Well, look, if Devin Nunes had been given the task of going into the old Trump casinos in Atlantic City and told to produce a finding, he would have said there was no gambling in the casino. So it's not surprising to me that he said there was no collusion here. He has proven over the course of the past year, this is the Republican chair of the House Intelligence Committee, for those of you who aren't following the ins and outs of it, he's proven over the course of the past year to be a handmaiden to the White House. He will do their bidding. He'll do what they ask. And what they asked him to do was write a report that said no collusion. He did it. Donald Trump turned around and tweeted in all caps, 240 characters, no collusion, no collusion, no collusion. The Democrats have issued their own report where they say that there is actually ample evidence of coordination, collusion, cheering on, efforts to meet with the Russians to gain dirt on Hillary Clinton, and the record is replete with that. So the issue at this point is not whether or not there were efforts by both the Russians and the Trump campaign to work together to undermine Hillary's campaign and advance Trump's. The question is, does that amount to being a criminal conspiracy? And that's what Bob Mueller is looking at.
In retrospect, it would appear that some of the particular, very personal animus between Vladimir Putin and Hillary Clinton stemmed from that period after the 2011 Russian parliamentary elections, and the sense from Putin before he came back to the presidency that the United States was encouraging those protests, those demonstrations that we saw in Leningrad and Moscow at the time. He essentially accused the United States of doing what he is now accused of doing in 2016, interfering in the democratic process, funding protests and interfering in the election itself. To what extent is the United States just now reaping what it sowed?
Well, you've got to divide between two sets of things. During the Cold War, going back to the 50s, 60s, and 70s, the United States engaged in all kinds of chicanery when it came to interfering in other countries. Coups in places like Iran and Guatemala, military takeovers in places like Chile. But this is no longer the Cold War, and the Cold War rules don't apply. And the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, and the rules-based order has moved forward. And so the kind of interference we saw from Russia in this election can no longer be justified by pointing to actions the United States took 60 years ago. Then there's this other set, which you're describing, which is, does Hillary Clinton speaking publicly at a meeting of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe and saying, we believe people have the right to peacefully protest and to have their votes counted legitimately, does that equal, is that the same thing as Donald Trump engaged in a vertically integrated information warfare campaign against the American election system? I would say that that is a laughable proposition to try to equate those two things. That's the kind of whataboutism that's, from the Soviet playbook and now from the Putin playbook. But the two things are not in any way comparable from my perspective.
Do you think, though, Jake, if once we zoom out from this period in history, that we will, we're seeing former Russian agents being poisoned in the UK. We're seeing diplomats expelled. This looks an awful lot like the Cold War. Did it ever really end?
I think we have to be careful to not fall into the trap of just reverting to the patterns and practices of the Cold War. We have to recognize that Russia is a very real adversary and a very real threat. They're a threat to the United States and our democratic system. They're a threat to our allies and partners. And they're engaged in all manner of gray, irregular warfare to try to destabilize and disrupt democracies around the world. And we've got to be clear-eyed about that, and we've got to be tough about it. But that doesn't mean we can't also work with the Russians on issues where our interests converge. For example, I helped negotiate the Iran nuclear deal, and at the very same moment that we were applying sanctions against Russia for its behavior in Ukraine, we were sitting down with Russian negotiators to help seal the deal with the Iranians. So I think we have to find a way to manage strategic competition with Russia as an adversary and cooperation with Russia where it can constructively advance our interests. And so I don't want to describe the period we're in now as a return to the Cold War and an extension of the Cold War. But I also don't want to be soft about the fact that Vladimir Putin is representing a really decisive and dramatic threat to the Western world, and that threat needs to be taken seriously and met with vigor.
Jake Sullivan, of course, we're all still waiting to see what comes out of Bob Mueller's inquiry into the 2016 election, Russia's involvement, possible collusion with the Trump campaign and so on. What is your gut telling you, though, at this stage, given at least on the face of it, the evidence that Donald Trump has this remarkably different stance towards Russia and Russia in particular?
You know, it's really amazing, right down to him firing Rex Tillerson the day after Tillerson had the audacity to agree with the British that the Russians were behind the spy poisoning. He is capable of saying mean and nasty things about just about everyone in the world, except for Vladimir Putin. He just can't do it. And there is something behind that. Whether Mueller gets to the bottom of it or not, whether it's in Mueller's remit or not, I can't hazard a guess. What I can say is that already Mueller has issued a series of indictments related to activities that took place in 2016, with the Russians working to try and help get Donald Trump elected, with Donald Trump and his team cheering that on and asking for that help. And my view is that there will be more to come from Mueller. There will be more shoes to drop, more people implicated, and whether it goes all the way to Trump or not, from a criminal perspective, I'm not sure. But at the end of this, I think it will be plain that Donald Trump made common cause with the Russians to try to get elected president of the United States. And the net result of that is him going soft on Vladimir Putin at a moment when we need our president to be firm. And that's a terrifying thought for people who care about America's national security.
Jake Sullivan, good to have you with us. Thanks for your time.
Thanks for having me.